The arrival of the 7th Marines gives Vandegrift the ability to have a fully manned perimeter and commence aggressive patrolling. How will he look to capitalise on the victory over the Japanese at Edson's Ridge?
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, this episode of the Principles of War podcast, number 141, Chesty Puller and the Second Battle of the Matanikau, covers the aftermath from the Battle of Edson's Ridge, the resupply problems that the Marines are facing on Guadalcanal, and Vandegrift's plan to seize the initiative from the Japanese. This is the 7th episode in our Guadalcanal series, and I'm joined again, as always, with our expert, Dave Holland. We're leading up to the Second Battle of the Matanikau. Dave is an expert in the Guadalcanal campaign. He's very much an expert in the battles of the Matanikau. In fact, he's written the book, The Battles of the Matanikau River. Today we're going to look at the prelude to Second Matanikau and the early skirmishing. Let's get right into the episode. Hey Dave, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, James, and glad to be back again, having a good chat. About the Matanikau.
Yeah, so last week, Edson's Ridge. In the aftermath of that, what was Vandegrift's intentions following on from that pivotal battle?
Yeah, so it was maintaining the same posture that he had done before the battle, where the number one priority is the integrity and maintaining the security of the airfield of Henderson, it named it at the time. So that was his main priority, and to continuously dig in and establish, strengthen his position, and to await further Japanese counterattacks. That was the main goal. Plus, to conduct active patrolling, just to keep the Japanese away from the perimeter. At this stage, after they defeated the Kawaguchi brigade, they knew they didn't destroy them, so they knew they're still out and about. So what he wanted to do was basically do limited patrolling, limited assaults, try to find them, lock them down, push them back, and just keep pounding them. That active defense, just keep them away from the airfield.
What were the Japanese trying to do? Obviously, they were trying to deny the Americans the use of the airfield. So after the failure at Edson's Ridge, what was their plan to consolidate and try and regain the initiative?
The repercussions from the Japanese defeat, Edson's Ridge or Bloody Ridge, went all the way to the Japanese High Command, to the Emperor. So at that stage, the Japanese developed an operation called Operation KA. I don't know what it stood for in Japanese, but it's definitely Operation KA. That involved the Imperial Japanese Navy and Imperial Japanese Army. So the Navy especially said, well, we've designated this area as the Americans' point of counterattack. This is where they've chosen to do their counterattack, the big counterattack back in the Pacific. So we're going to throw everything we can down in that area of Guadalcanal. So the IGA, as you know, was committed in China, but they still had resources. So basically what happened, it was a theater-wide call for resources. So the plan was to send the complete 2nd Sendai Division plus part of the 38th Division initially straight in with a number of heavy artillery. When I say heavy artillery, I mean 150, 100 millimeter howitzers and guns, tanks, all these different support units. So roughly it was around 18,000 men that decided to do the big counterattack against the Americans, or take the airfield. I wouldn't say counterattack, basically take the airfield to continue their assault. Also, Yamamoto was going to use the combined fleet. At the same time, when this massive land attack was occurring, he was going to use the combined fleet to try to lure the American fleet out once and for all, to do a decisive battle, which they're always pushed for at sea. So this was going to be the final act, so to speak, for the Japanese. They intended we're going to wipe the Americans out once and for all down here. So that was their intent. So they started scrambling forces together to stage their fight. And their assault was, I think, the 20th. It keeps moving, but initially it was the 12th. No, excuse me. It was the 20th of October. So that was their H-hour D-Day, so to speak. Or X-Day, they called it. That was their main plan.
So we've got the Battle of Edson's Ridge on September 12th, and we're going to look at Second Matanikau, which is on the 23rd of September. In between that, the USS Wasp is sunk by the submarine I-19 on September 15. So the supply situation is still quite perilous for the Marines on Guadalcanal leading up to Second Matanikau. How did Vandegrift balance offensive action with security, given that his logistics train was still very much contested?
So it goes back to, I think, the first question. With his limited patrolling, with his limited defenses, he knew the information was coming in. His 3rd Rifle Regiment, once again, I think we mentioned before, he had the 2nd Marine Regiment on loan. So he had 3 Rifle Regiments there, but the 7th Marines was one of the core units of the 1st Marine Division. So they'd been sent earlier, I think I mentioned this too, they'd been sent earlier in April to go to Samoa, to garrison Samoa, in addition with a whole battalion of the 75 millimeter artillery and a whole tank company. So they were a nice little combined unit. They were actually a brigade. So they were there. So they missed the initial landings. So they'd been replaced, and Turner, the amphibious force commander, had told Vandegrift that now you're getting the 7th Marines reinforced. They're coming your way. Expected to land on the 18th of September. Initially, Turner wanted to put them on another part of the island. Because once again, it's like we discussed earlier, most of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the higher command, was looking at this as land grab more land. It was all about land possession. Well, Vandegrift and the division knew it was all about the airfield. Just secure the airfield. Japanese could have the rest of the island. Who cares? As long as they maintain that strategic goal of the airfield. That was their whole primary mission. So they always kept battling the Naval High Command, especially Turner, because Turner wanted to, in fact, one of the Chief of Staff, Colonel Jerry Thomas of the division, nicknamed Turner General Admiral Turner because he was acting like a general. And it goes back to the days of the wooden ships where, he had the Hornblower series and all that, where the Naval Admiral actually landed on, once they on shore, he commanded all the forces on land too. So that was, those days were gone. But they kept pushing back for Turner. He wanted to do that. So Turner visited him right before Bloody Ridge. He was bombarded one night, and then he kind of changed his mind. And he said, Vandegrift, where you want him? He goes, can you dump them straight? And he pointed Lunga Point. Can you dump them straight in the perimeter? He goes, yep, no problem. So that's what happened. So the major convoy, and you're talking about the Wasp and the rest of them, were protecting this convoy coming in. So they came in on the 18th of September, over 4,000 Marines. But this was the first major resupply that the division had. So at this stage, once they landed, Vandegrift could establish his 360-degree perimeter. And then the food situation was good, but it didn't alleviate it. They were still down to 2 meals a day. But once again, when they landed, now they had barbed wire. Now they had razor blades to the detriment of some of the Marines. But little things like that. But they landed, and plus there was a big boost of morale because they said, look, the first team has finally arrived. Because once again, when I discussed earlier, to send that regiment to Samoa, they fleshed out the regiment with some of the best NCOs and best officers, best equipment, expecting them to be the first to fight. But ironically, they missed the fight when the rest of the division sailed away and landed on 7th of August. But that regiment was full of talent. Right? You had legends or soon-to-be legends, guys like Chesty Puller, H.H. Hannikin. You had Mitchell Page, John Basilone. You had Colonel Armour Sims. So it was a well-loaded regiment. And when he landed, it was ready to fight. And Vandegrift was going to use them for his strategies of limited offensives, active defense, as Vandegrift called it.
So there's a couple of interesting things in there. We see Turner actually coming out to see Vandegrift so that he gets an idea of what it's actually like on Guadalcanal, which is, for a joint force commander, that's probably really important. And Admiral Gormley, he didn't get out to Guadalcanal at all.
No, never did.
Much to the chagrin of Nimitz. And it's the first time that Vandegrift can actually put a continuous line, one solid defensive perimeter around the airfield, which when you're facing an enemy like the Japanese, who quite like the ability to go around the flanks, find the weaknesses and penetrate in, it's probably quite important for the defensive posture. For the Japanese, they're getting reinforced as well.
Oh, yes. I mean, at the time, like I said, the 2nd Division was coming in. So the first regiment of the 2nd Division to arrive was the 4th Regiment with the Elba detachment, named after their colonel. So they were detached from the division, because if you might know, a lot of these Japanese divisions in the opening stages of the war fought independently. The regiments of the division. So they would go in as a division, but they just sent out one regiment here, one regiment there, and one regiment there, and they formed detachments. So this is one of the detachments, the infantry. So if you remember back on Edison's Ridge, there was one battalion of the 4th involved, the 2nd battalion, involved in the fight. So they were attached to Kawaguchi. And then the 3rd battalion came in to assist Oka. Didn't miss the fight, but they came in to assist. So you already had 2 battalions there by mid-September. And then the waiting for the additional battalion and a regimental headquarters, which was the 1st battalion. So they landed in late September. So you had a whole regiment roughly there. 1 battalion had been well handled at Edson's Ridge, but 2 battalions were very fresh. That was the initial reinforcements that was coming in. And then Kawaguchi still had his 35th Brigade. Once again, they'd lost about 800 guys, and they still had their wounded, but they were making their way back to the Matanikau. And there they were going to establish a defensive line and then wait for the rest of the reinforcements to come in to conduct their large offensive.
Now, Marine intelligence suggested that there was around 400 Japanese troops in the area. How did they arrive at that figure, and how accurate was it?
It wasn't accurate at all, but Merle Twining, the division planner, D3, actually referred to him as the Cubana Vagabonds. And Cubana was an area down the coast. We said a bunch of vagabonds. There was something I could never lock down, because they knew that Kawaguchi landed with like almost 4,000 guys. They knew they didn't kill all 4,000 of them. So they thought there was a dispirited mob moving back. So I knew they wasn't more than 400. Some of their intelligence, like I said before, their intelligence relied on the scouts. And the scouts was mainly on the east side. They didn't really operate too much on the west side. So there was sporadic information coming back. They had thought Kawaguchi had kept retreating and went down the coast and didn't stop in Matanikau. It was just some of the stragglers in that area from Matanikau to Point Cruz, which is roughly a mile, holding that line. They thought the majority of Japanese had pulled back further down the west coast to wait for the reinforcements to come in. So that's what the Japanese were looking at reinforcement-wise. I'll just go back to the line. You mentioned Vandegrift had established a 360-degree perimeter when the 7th Marines come in. The Marines had to pull a bit of information out of the normal doctrine, because at this stage, the defensive doctrine was a defense in depth. It wasn't a cordon defense. And as you know, a cordon defense is a line with little support behind it. Where defense in depth is what it says. It's a defense in a series of fallback or depth positions, like first line, second line, third line, with some reinforcements behind it. And as we know, the cordon defense was a line, and that became obsolete in the middle of the Great War, the First War, where especially where the French would have their lines, the German artillery would just blast major holes in the line, and they just pour straight through. So they adopted the techniques to have the defense in depth. So we got to attack defensive belts and belts and belts. Well, that was the normal operating doctrine, defensive doctrine for all the Western armies. And after that, and up to the time of Guadalcanal battle. So the Marines had to go outside the normal doctoral thinking and adopt the cordon defense. And the Japanese, if you remember, the Japanese had adopted their offensive tactics to defeat the defense in depth, because the Japanese said, look, we don't have massive firepower to defeat these Western type armies, so how are we going to defeat them? We use our strengths, which is speed, shock, and surprise, not attacks, infiltration attacks, to defeat the defense in depth. So that was what the Japanese had been studying through these years. So Vandegrift had a look, and he goes, well, I can form a 360-degree perimeter. I still don't have enough men to form a defense in depth, because one, the perimeter is not that big, so you can't really have too many defensive lines back. So he spoke to Edson. He says, what's the gaps that we can leave between units? And Edson said, 5 yards. So he thought, well, yeah, we're going to have to form a defensive line, a cordon. So what they did was they formed a cordon. They used the terrain as their allies. So they knew the thick jungle. They thought, well, if we can cut off the thick jungle or cut off the avenues of approach around that thick jungle, we have to force our enemy to move through a thick jungle line. And if we do that, then any force moving through there will be so attrited and the unit coherency broken up that if when they did reach our line, there wouldn't be much use. And we'll see in October that's what happened. So what Vandegrift did, he put 2 battalions on line, and he had 1 battalion behind them. And they just formed the line. And the orders were the Marines, too, and this is very important to counter the Japanese infiltration techniques. The orders were, if you get overrun or if they move into your flanks, just stay there. Just maintain your position and keep fighting. Do an all-around security position, just keep fighting, because we got people behind you going to take care of them. That will counter the Japanese techniques or tactics, because they expect, the old Zulu technique, the horns of the rhino. Once the two elements go around, they expect that if you're surrounded, then you'll just break apart, which they'd work very well for them in the first 6 or 7 months. They said, no, just hang out, stay in your positions, and hope for the best. And that's what they did. And that was what they based it on. Plus, you had all this artillery support that could hit anywhere around that perimeter. So they just dug in, did the cordon line. Now they had some barbed wire, and they took the 7th Marines, and they sent them down south where Edson's Ridge was, and they dug in. So if you go there to this day, you still see barbed wire there on Edson's Ridge. It's not from the Battle of Edson's Ridge, because I think we discussed earlier that the Raiders didn't have barbed wire. They had like 1 or 2 strands, but not much. But when the 7th Marines landed, they had entrenching kits, they had picks, shovels, axes, spools and spools of barbed wire. So then they just dug coconut log bunkers, trenches, and fortified that area. So that was another thing, too. They once fortified the area with a lot of automatic weapons, because the Marines brought a lot of automatic weapons with them. They're also their Amtracs, amphibious tractors. Each one of them, before they left, Vandegrift says, they asked us, can we put extra machine guns on these Amtracs before they left New Zealand? They go, yeah. So each Amtrak had like 3 machine guns on it. Had like 2 30 cals and a 50 cal. So what they did with those things, they stripped most of those guns out and just spread them around the perimeter. So the perimeter had just probably double or triple the amount of machine guns that it required, that normally it was required for an infantry battalion. And plus they had 37 millimeters, and they had a lot of heavy firepower that can counter any Japanese offensive. But that's what the Marines did. They thought out of the box, and they had to. They thought about their techniques, and they thought about what the Japanese were up against, and they said, what are we looking at here? The textbook doesn't fit this situation, so we're going to adapt our techniques to fit our situation with the terrain and what we're up against. And they knew the Japanese didn't have a lot of artillery to mass, and the Japanese didn't fire a lot of times battery fire to blow holes in line, like was the whole idea of the defense in depth. There's no holes can be blown in the line and hundreds of Japanese are going to pour through. That's not how they worked. That was really good thinking by the division, Vandegrift and the division staff.
I think that that's a really important point, because if you look at jungle warfare in Burma, in New Guinea, in Malaya, it took a lot of effort to be able to advance the doctrine and the tactics, to understand that you needed to stay and fight, you needed to have decent artillery support. And I think probably the most critical part was the moral ascendancy. You needed to know that there was going to be someone in the reserve who was going to be pushing through and pushing the Japanese back if you were surrounded. And so for just after a couple of initial contacts, for Vandegrift to be able to come up with that recipe, which took quite a lot of, we see Lieutenant Colonel Ian Stewart being able to do that in Malaya, but it took a bit of time for the Australians to be able to develop that capability, and it took a bit of time in Burma as well. So that's very quick military innovation and adaptation to fighting a new enemy, which is quite impressive.
Yeah, and Twining, if you read his memoirs and his interviews, he said, look, if we'd have failed, they would have said, look, you went outside, you had a cordon defense, no wonder you're using obsolete tactics. He said that it would have been criticized whether we used it or not, but we thought we were going to go with what we thought would work. And it did.
So the arrival of the 7th Marine Regiment, this enables Vandegrift to be able to do some offensive patrolling, and he sends a patrol out from Henderson Field, which is led by Chesty Puller. What do we know about Chesty Puller?
Yeah, well, I think most people who know anything about Marine Corps history knows that Chesty Puller was most decorated Marine of all time, probably most famous Marine of all time. At the time of when he landed, he was 44 years old, come from Virginia. He'd been a career Marine since 1919. He missed the Great War. He joined as a private in 1918, and they kept him. They said, oh, he was so good that they kept him back to drill instructor, which is true, but that's generally what they did because he had a little bit of military training, I think. So, yeah, they kept him back, and then he went into the officers' school. He was commissioned as second lieutenant, and then the war ended. They had all these excess second lieutenants and officers, so they gave him discharges. So then he's turned around and joined up as a private again. And because the Marines were sending troops into Haiti and Nicaragua at the time, still fighting the Banana War. So that's what he did. He joined up and he went straight into Haiti, Nicaragua. He was commissioned in the gendarmerie, or I can't pronounce it in French, but yeah, the local constabulary down there in Haiti. And then he went to Nicaragua. He ran combat patrols. In fact, they gave him the company, which is like the fire brigade company, they called it. He went on a lot of patrols down there, a lot of firefights, he was awarded 2 Navy crosses, which is this U.S.'s second highest medal for valor, right under the Medal of Honor. So he had 2 of them already. And he was known as a great Banana War fighter. He was already legendary. I won't say legendary, but very well known in the Marine Corps. Very aggressive commander. He always led from the front. And yeah, he was in his prime as a battalion commander, in my opinion. Probably more. And Commander was definitely as a battalion commander. But he landed, and basically what they was going to do is the chief of staff, as soon as Puller landed, it was a funny story. Puller landed because, like I said, he missed the initial landings because they thought they were going to be the first to fight. He's always bragging, we're going to fight, we're going to kill the Japanese, blah, blah. And when they had landed on the 18th of September, he came in. And apparently the story was he walked in, he's looking around, someone hands him a map, and he goes, I can't read this map. And he throws it down and says, just put me where the Japs are. And then one of his buddies, Twining, actually comes up and goes, you don't read about this story much. And he goes, now, about the time you showed up, Puller, you've missed a fight. You've been sleeping and drinking coconuts down, and we've been fighting the Japanese. And yeah, they all laughed at him at that stage, and he laughed back. So, but yeah, they were intended on using him as quick as they could because he was designated as a great battalion commander and a very aggressive commander, and they had a fresh unit. So Vandegrift was going to use these guys right off the bat to do his active defense. They was going to do a reconnaissance in force and try to find where the Japanese had went after Edson's Ridge.
So what was the force that he took out with him? And they initially moved off to Mount Austin. How did the first part of the patrol unfold?
Yeah, so the plan was on the 24th, they started on the 23rd of September. Puller was going to move on the northern slopes of Mount Austin because you got to remember you had the coastal track. And what they're going to do with Puller, he was going to proceed over the northern slopes of Mount Austin and then come down on the Matanikau River about 2,000 yards upstream. And then he was going to move up the east bank and cross and go to a place called Cucambona, which is another 3 miles. And there at Cucambona, they were going to establish a patrol base. When he reached the mouth of Matanikau, the 1st Raider Battalion was proceeding up the government track. They were going to push through Puller's unit, then take Cucambona. And there they were going to establish a major patrol base. Because in Cucambona was where all the jungle trails were at. So if Vandegrift thought if he could have the 1st Raider Battalion operating out of Cucambona, then that would give him a buffer of 8 miles to the west. 8 miles to the west. So he wanted to create a buffer zone around the airfield to keep the Japanese as far away as he could. So you got to remember, at this stage, they didn't know the importance of Matanikau, which they will after this upcoming battle. But yeah, they were just trying to push the Japanese back and keep them on their toes, keep them off balance by hitting them with these small limited offenses. As you know, they couldn't push a lot of battalions too far outside the perimeter because they had to preserve that integrity of the airfield. So that was the plan. So Puller was going to proceed up, and it basically reconnaissance in force. That's what it was going to be. And he was going to see what was up around upper Mount Austin, and then go down the banks of Matanikau, trying to find out where the Japanese had went. They thought they were further down the coast. So that was the plan. And he left on the 23rd, and they're moving. He left on the 24th. They left the perimeter on the 24th of September.
What did they find when they got to Mount Austin?
Like Major General Kawaguchi had done, because they still had stragglers coming in from the Edson's Ridge fight, because they'd retreated from the Edson's Ridge on the 15th of September. So what they'd done, they established straggling points. The Japanese did. The Japanese had built a trail called the Missouri Road, or the East-West Trail, as the Americans called it. And they'd hacked out when I said road, it was mainly a good trail. And that was their retreat route. And they hacked it out. But along this trail, they'd set up straggling points, or water points, as they called them, at certain strategic areas around hills, so they could dominate it. And each one of these straggling points, they had roughly a reinforced platoon to a company at each one. Had one battalion spread out there, and they were collecting the stragglers. So that's along that track. So you got Puller, he didn't know that, and the Puller's heading along this trail following the Japanese.
Now, what combat occurred on Mount Austin?
Yeah, so on the 24th, in the afternoon of the 24th, Puller's battalion had struck one of these. They got hit by like a horseshoe-shaped defense with 7 machine guns, and they got hit pretty hard. This was the first really fight. So once they pushed the Marines back a bit, suffered some casualties, it's starting to get, darkness was falling. So Puller pulled his guys up to a couple of hills to dig in for the night and treat his wounded. So he'd radio back he'd been hit. So what Vandegrift did, he sent up 2-5, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, a whole battalion up there with orders to assist the evacuation of Puller's wounded. At this stage, when the morning time came, he had 25 wounded and 10 dead, and most of those were stretcher cases. So they bring stretchers and stuff up. So Battalion Commander 2-5 was just acting. He was only a captain. So he brought a personal message from Vandegrift telling Puller, look, you can either pull back or you can proceed. Puller being Puller, aggressive commander, he goes, yep, I can proceed. He took 2-5 with him. So what he did, he sent 2 of his companies back to escort the 25 wounded. So 2 companies, and that's another thing too, because I used to go up on these hills and I tell that story. They'd go, he took 280 men back to escort 25 wounded. I said, yeah, they're all stretcher cases. And if you look, he had to go back something like 3 miles over jungle ravines and streams. And anyone that asked me that, I said, we never carried a stretcher before, because you'd have to take at least 8 men on rotating on stretcher crew. Then you have to have security, and times 25 wounded. Yeah, the numbers add up quite quickly. So what he did, he took 2-5, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, C Company of his own battalion in his headquarter group, and they continued on. And the Japanese had pulled back to that stage, so Puller had moved in, and on the 26th, he's come down the ridge, hit the east bank in Matanikau, and moved down to Matanikau. And he was going to go to the mouth of Matanikau and cross over. And that was going to be his plan. So on the 26th, he's at the mouth of Matanikau. He sends 1 company over, and they get hit pretty hard. Because what the Japanese had done, they'd beefed up the Matanikau, and they'd formed a defensive line on the Matanikau River. So they get hit pretty hard, they pull back. Puller sends them across again. So I call this Alligator Creek in reverse. Because what you have here is an American commander sending troops running across an open sandbar. The sandbar was roughly 100 feet long and 50 feet wide. So he's running across the sandbar against fixed machine gun positions. So after 2 assaults, it was mainly G Company, got hit pretty hard. And he pulled them back. So then he radios back and says, look, I've got a lot of casualties. I need some CASEVAC and things like that. So this was a reconnaissance in force kind of gone wrong. At this stage, in hindsight, they probably should have just stopped and pulled back.
We'll leave the episode there. We'll be back next week with the main combat in the Second Battle of the Matanikau. A big thank you to Dave there. Not only is he bringing the Guadalcanal campaign to life, but he's really bringing out the lessons learned from this important campaign. There's 3 things that I want to reflect on in this episode that I think are really important. The first one is we are starting to see the evolution of the concept of CLIF and CADF, the Commander Land Forces and the Commander Amphibious Task Force. Those roles being performed by Major General Vandegrift and Rear Admiral Kelly Turner. It's an important relationship to get right, and it's one of those relationships that really relies on both officers having the ability to see the problem from the other officer's side. They need to be able to rely on their professional judgment. They need to be able to make sacrifices and compromises in the planning and execution of the operation. Secondly, something I think is really important is the fact that Kelly Turner actually went out to see Vandegrift. He went to see him in his location. He got to see what the conditions were like on Guadalcanal, and he actually was able to have a serious conversation with him, look him in the eye, see what the problems were, discuss those problems, tell him the problems that he was facing so that everyone had much better situational awareness of the issues facing Navy and the Marines as they were trying to seize Guadalcanal. We mentioned the sinking of the carrier Wasp. The Wasp was actually providing cover for the convoy that was delivering the 7th Marines to Guadalcanal. She was spotted by the Japanese submarine I-19, which fired a spread of 6 Type 95 torpedoes. They're the long-lance torpedoes, and I definitely want to talk about them in a future episode because they're a very interesting weapon. The design and employment of the long-lance torpedoes has lessons for today when it comes to developing a way of war around a technology that can be developed by an industrial base. 3 of the torpedoes hit the Wasp, 1 hit the USS O'Brien, and another hit the battleship North Carolina. The O'Brien was a destroyer, and the structural damage that she suffered would see her sink 1 month later. Turner was to write a few things about logistics, and I think it's worthwhile going through some of the statements that he wrote. It was his belief that the United States Navy's concept of logistics broadened mightily during the early months of World War II, and in no part of naval combat operations did logistics require a larger part of the commander's attention than in our early amphibious operations. He said that 80% of my time was given to logistics during the first 4 months of the Watchtower operation because we were living from one logistics crisis to another. On August 23, he wrote a 6-page letter to Major General Vandegrift, and in it he wrote, "This whole Marine and Navy supply system down here seems to be bad, and I'm trying to get them to reorganize it so it will function." And in a letter to Captain Greenman in early November dealing with the logistics situation, Turner wrote, "All the amphibious force ships, all my staff and myself are working our hearts out to keep you going and to try and get men and supplies to you. One of our troubles is to get decisions on matters I do not have under my control and to get material to you which is available but for which we have no transportation." Greenman had been on the Astoria when she was sunk, and he was working in a naval headquarters on the logistics problems of supplying Guadalcanal. He also wrote to Vandegrift on another occasion, "Your situation as regards food, fuel and ammunition, as you well know, gives me the greatest anxiety. This is still a hand-to-mouth existence. By now, I had hoped that you would have some reasonable resources. However, the enemy has held up our deliveries so continuously that our cash in bank is very low. You can rest assured that every ship I can get my hands on will be used to relieve this critical situation." That was on the 16th of November, 1942. That is 2 months after the Second Battle of the Matanikau. So there's still another 60 days of parlous logistics. I think it is right and proper that we have the wise words of Kelly Turner just to remind us of all of the work that was being done to ensure that those supplies got to the Marines and the soldiers on Guadalcanal. Both the Marines and the IJA paid the price of the inability of their navies to wrest sea control from their adversary. Both navies fully understood the importance of that, and that is why such a high price was paid by the navies to try and maintain sea control. That point is reinforced by the fact that more sailors died in the Guadalcanal campaign than Marines and soldiers combined. And when we look at the naval battles, we will see just how fierce the fighting was in and around the surrounds of Iron Bottom Sound. We'll be back next week to look at the main component of the Second Battle of the Matanikau and a Medal of Honor recipient from the US Coast Guard.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.